Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anthony Guglielmi. I'm the newest member of the media and communications team. I'm just up here to introduce a video that we shot. Bailey Vandiver and myself went down to Letcher County to interview some farmers that were affected by the flooding recently and show the effects the environment can have on small farmers. So without further ado, here's the video.
Well, the night of the flooding, we woke up, it was pouring the rain and kept pouring the rain, and we went out on the porch with a mining light and watched the creek. It just keeps raising and raising. And then all at once my wife says, look, and the branch water was coming down behind her, and a bunch of trees had fell and hit, overflowed and run into her, started coming into her basement. And then I kind of panicked. This is our home and our farm, and we farm here. And I'm a retired coal miner, and then got into farming for the market at Whitesburg about 5 years ago. And we just continue getting a little bit larger every year and learning a lot every year. Well, we grow heirloom beans in the fall, and pumpkins and watermelon and squash and cushaw, and we grow a lot of potatoes. I lost a lot of my blackberry patch, and the cushaw and pumpkin, I've lost probably 85% of it. I lost a lot of row covers, T-posties, and wooden fence posties, and frost blankets. They went down the creek. A lot of them was wrapped around the trees here. We woke up, it was pouring the rain and kept pouring the rain, and we went out on the porch with a mining light and watched the creek. It just keeps raising and raising. And then all at once my wife says, look, and the branch water was coming down behind her, and a bunch of trees had fell and hit, overflowed and run into her, started coming into her basement. And then I kind of panicked, and I grabbed a tractor and built a levee to help stop it. Then I went to get a pump, an irrigation pump at the back, and cut my hand in the meantime. Well, I got back and I got the pump going, and getting back to cutting my hand, it wasn't a very bad cut, I didn't pay attention to it, but 2 days later it was as big as a boxing glove. And we were trapped over here. Our bridge washed out as the water went down. And the branch water, we couldn't get our vehicles across there. So then finally I got my rollback truck here and run the bed across the creek and loaded our vehicle up so I could go to the ER, get me a tetanus shot and some antibiotics. But our basement filled with mud, and we lost all the furniture in it, freezer. We had a lot of heirloom seeds down there in freezers. It turned over and was floating, so we lost some of those. Everybody needs the ground is contaminated. Good farmland is covered with mud and creek bed gravel and erosion. It's set it back a lot. And I had it, and so has everybody else. And people with animals that took their fences out, and they've lost their hay. But we work every day cleaning it up. We've had a rough time, but not near as bad as other people. Plenty of friends and neighbors have it much worse than we have.
So I want to talk about flooding in Kentucky in general first, and then about how flooding affects farms in eastern Kentucky, talk about last year's flooding event, and then what's happening this year. So Kentucky has a flooding problem. With only 1% of the nation's population, we account for 4% of flood deaths in the nation. And out of 126 major flooding disasters nationwide, I think that was over the past 10 years, 12 were Kentucky flood disasters. That's us accounting for almost 10% of the nation's major flood disasters. And if Kentucky has a flood problem, then Kentucky farms have a flood problem. So I've put together some information about major flooding disasters. So these are things that got presidential disaster declarations. So this is not even touching all the small and localized flash flooding events that also happen in Kentucky and affect farms. And this was also something I put together last year, so not all of it has been updated for this year's information. But prior to 2022, in the past 4 years, there were 5 major presidential disaster declarations involving flooding in Kentucky. And you can see there's a lot of concentration in eastern Kentucky with these events. All 5 of those in the last 4 years before this occurred in February. 2 of them were at the end of February, bridging over into March. In 2018, we had 2 separate major flooding events, both in February. Those are the ones at the bottom of the screen there. So you can see the one was more northeast and along the Ohio River, and then the earlier February one was more eastern Kentucky. In those 5 disasters, there was one county that was declared a FEMA disaster area in all 5 of those, and that was Lawrence County. Lawrence County actually wasn't affected by the flooding this year. 4 out of 5 flooding disasters affected Knox, Clay, Leslie, Pike, Boyd, and Metcalf, and some of those got hit again this year. So I made these composite maps. The one at the top left was from last year, showing the 10 years prior. And the one in the bottom right, I've updated to include this year's flooding, what we know so far as FEMA declarations go. This is how many times those counties have been in major disaster flooding declarations. So looking back a little further, we looked 20 years back, we looked 5 years back, we looked 10 years back. Looking back 20 years, there have been 34 major disaster declarations in Kentucky in 20 years, and 30 of those 34 were flooding. Only 4 of those years did not have at least one major disaster declaration for flooding. And the most major flood disasters to occur was in 2015, when we had 4 separate major flooding disaster events in 1 year. And then February 2018 was the only time that 2 major flooding events have happened in 1 month. Because of FEMA damages reporting, we have a lot of information about the extent of damages from different flooding events, as far as how widespread geographic, and then how much dollar damages are done. So this orange line on here represents a combination of individual assistance and municipal assistance. So we have some pretty good information about how extensive flood damages are. But what we don't have really good information on is how much damage is done to farms in these situations. And you might notice in the media attention, there's a lot of attention on houses being damaged. There's a lot of attention on towns, roads, bridges being washed out, but you don't, a lot of times don't hear about how farms are affected. But we know that there are farms in all of these counties. So here I pulled some farm census data just for those darkest red counties that have been affected by major flooding 9 to 10 times in the last 10 years. And so you're looking at a total of, there's over 1,000 farms just in those 6 counties, 158,000 acres of land in farms, and over 5 million in sales just in those 6 counties. So this is, and not all of those farms would flood, not all of those 1,000 farms would flood, but many of them would be affected. Last year, building on some pandemic relief that Community Farm Alliance had done with the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky, we were in a good place to be able to respond quickly to the flooding in February of last year. This is an aerial view of Irvin in Estill County. I used to live over on the top right corner there. So as a part of that relief effort, we got a little bit more information about how farms are affected in a flooding event like this. So this isn't one of the most beautiful maps I've ever made, but this is the darker gray counties on here are the counties that were included in the FEMA disaster declaration for that particular flooding event last late winter, early spring. And what we were able to do with the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky was to give grants, very small grants, of up to $1,500 per farm. And we ended up funding 202 farms through that effort in 27 counties and gave out a total of $250,000. And we learned a lot about the farms through this effort. So here we are with what counties farms got funded in, and we had the most in Clay, Morgan, Breathitt, Magoffin, Lawrence, and Estill counties. And what those farms are growing. So mostly livestock farms. Next to that, non-edible horticultural crops was primarily hay, but also some tobacco, and then vegetables, poultry, and a little bit of grains and fruit and nut trees. And this is what we learned from the impacts that farms have. We don't have dollar amounts necessarily, other than what people told us their estimated damages were, but these are the number of farms that reported these different kinds of damage. And the number one thing you see at the top there is fencing that was either damaged or destroyed or completely swept away in some cases. And debris and sand deposits affecting over 100 farms. The need to reseed, fertilize fields that had either mud deposits or where soil had where erosion had washed away topsoil. A lot of soil gets moved around in these events. Lots of damaged barns, buildings, hay and feed lost, washed out damaged roads, and then a whole host of other things that were mentioned as damages. I put a yellow arrow there by lost and damaged crops, because when we get to talking about this year's event, it's going to be a really different situation, because this event took place in late February, early March, where most planting hadn't happened yet. So crop loss wasn't even a major possibility at that point. Different story this year in the peak of the growing season. So that brings us to this year in July's flooding, where we're really just beginning to get the assessments of what all the damages look like, but it's a really different situation this year than last year. And a lot of this, I'm relying very heavily on my colleague, Jennifer Weber, who is in Perry County in Hazard, and she's working I can't even imagine how many hours she's putting in right now, doing emergency flood relief efforts, and then also she's in the thick of all kinds of local food system development, working with farmers markets there. So getting reports from Jennifer on a daily basis. So looking at the difference between the last year's flood event and this year's, last year the water rose over a period of several days of intense rain, but in this year it was really concentrated within 24 hours of extreme rainfall. Jennifer says on their mountain she got 11 inches of rain in 24 hours. So last year it was minimal crop loss, and this year we're in the peak of growing season, and that has some reverberating effects, like effects on farmers markets and whether they have product to sell and whether they can satisfy consumer demand. It has effects on food preservation because people would normally be putting up a lot of their winter food supply at this point. And all of the food system work that we've been doing in Eastern Kentucky is really on hold because the people who have been doing it are just responding to emergency needs right now. Another big difference is that when the flood happened last year, it was happening basically in a refrigerator, but this year we're in the peak of heat, and that accelerates all kinds of other problems, disease, rot, for both livestock, for the humans involved, for the plant diseases. It accelerates the growth of mold in everything that's been flooded. So that's another big problem this year. And to add insult to injury, this came on the heels of some of these areas having not had rain in almost 2 months. So there were delays anyhow, and lots of farmers and even home gardeners who would have been putting up a lot of produce at this time of year were really just starting to get into their production because of the delays from the drought. So some of the things we're hearing, I wanted to share you some things that Jennifer said about the damages. She said the damages from this flooding are not like other flooding that they've seen. Like there's a house that was built in the 1850s, an old farmhouse that has never been flooded since the 1850s, that's the foundation is now compromised. She says the damages are almost more like what you would expect to see from a tsunami than from flash flooding, because there was just so much water that was moving so fast, and it was just incredibly destructive. Swept away everything in its path. One farmer says she had that her fields are decimated, all the canning and preserving she had already done, and all of her harvested garlic that was hanging to cure is all washed downriver. Her barn roof is at the end of her field. She has no idea where the rest of her barn is. Her 2 small tractors are both upside down and were underwater for hours. Other equipment is in a heap. All of her grow lights and greenhouse are swept away, and all of her supplies for starting seeds. All of their vehicles, which they put up as high on the ground as they could, were all submerged and destroyed. Another farmer's crops were completely wiped out, including hay for his cattle. The kids' chickens, 120 or so chickens, were all gone. Their equipment was submerged and destroyed. The barn is still there, but the structural integrity is doubtful. High tunnels have been submerged, all the crops in them gone, tunnels damaged, equipment washed downriver, damage destroyed. Just so much, she says. Of course, the help that's needed, everything is going to require money to help, both for immediate needs and for long-term recovery. Debris clearing and removal is one of the things we've heard the most, that they can't even start to do any kind of recovery until they can clear out stuff. There's one farmer who needs to just get all the metal out of her fields. She can't even get her equipment into the fields until she can know that she's not going to bust her tractor tires. Mending, replacing fencing, land grading from all the earth moving that happened, reseeding pastures, fertilizer, so much topsoil washed away, repairs to roads and culverts, which may spill over some into more long-term, replacing supplies, tools, and feed. Everything that could wash away did. You see in this picture, this is from a farmer's garage where all of their tools have had seeds washed into them with the mud and are now sprouting in their equipment shed. Erosion control is a big concern, income replacement. So much of what would have been income over the coming months is a loss. Replacing food supplies. So many of our farmers are growing not only to sell, but they're growing what they're going to eat through the winter. And then it might seem ironic, but people really need assistance applying for assistance because government programs can be complex. They require paperwork. They all have different requirements. They all have different circumstances for how you get paid and what you get paid for. So that's sorting through all that is a chore. And then looking more long term, again, we'll need funding, rebuilding infrastructure, everything from buildings, roads, to processing capacity. There's potential that there are pieces of shared use equipment that might become really useful in the future for responding to flood events like this. Like some of our farmers have said that having a hay rake was really helpful for removing debris from fields. Some places need a roll-off or heavy equipment for moving large debris. Developing a quick response network that can be ready to go when events like this happen, because as everyone is telling us that Kentucky's just going to get wetter and wetter and have more and more of these extreme rain events. Larger area watershed management is a real concern. Farmers can only do so much to control what's happening with the water that falls on their own land. I think this really could use some attention in media help to realize that farms are part of the systems that are affected by floods. There are a couple points of research that I think can be really helpful in this area, university people. What kind of land use is appropriate in these flood zones, and what are the long-term effects of soil contamination from everything ends up in floodwaters, and so what can our farmers do to mitigate that contamination? And I'll just leave this here with between Community Farm Alliance and the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky, we've got a flood response team together. We're going to be working through, we've got applications coming in now for this year's flood relief. We hope we're going to be able to give a little bit more money than the $1,500 we were able to do last year per farm. And then there's a lot of other help coming in from deer extension people in the area, from Cattlemen's Association, from the Southeast Kentucky sheep and goat producers, from conservation districts, Grow Appalachia, and the Department of Ag. And any donations that you can make to the Foundation for Appalachian Kentucky, to their family farm fund, would be greatly appreciated. And that was all that I had for you all. Thanks for keeping the folks in Eastern Kentucky in mind.